In this lesson, we'll consider various ways to interpret data so we make reliable and valid instructional decisions, and two pre-established decision-making rules will be emphasized: level of performance and trend of performance. Now, decision rules are part of an intervention planning process as they provide us with a method for looking at our data and then determining what instructional changes are needed. Decision rules are usually written around a student's level or trend of performance, and they're also how we can reliably and confidently make decisions about whether or not a program is working. So in the problem identification phase of the problem-solving model, we determine the baseline performance, usually through benchmarking. Then in plan development, we establish a goal of expected performance. Now consider an oral reading fluency example that's given here. We establish a baseline of 56 words per minute, and based on research, we expect our students to gain 1.5 words per week. And over 12 weeks, this gives us a goal of 74 words read per minute. Now when graphing this, we draw a line from the baseline level of performance to the goal, establishing a trajectory of the improvement that's needed over time to reach that goal. Then to determine how the student's performance rates, you can compare your collected data to the goal line. Now with the goal line, you can compare the student's data each time it's collected, and you can decide if the level of performance is what it needs to be by comparing each data point to the goal line. So if you're at a point to make a decision and 3, 4, or 5 consecutive data points are above the goal line, then the student is exceeding expectations. Now in contrast, if there are 3, 4, or 5 consecutive points below the goal line, the student is not meeting expectations. And this is important to know because changes to the intervention will be required. And finally, if the collected data is on the goal line, the student is doing exactly as expected. And these kind of decisions are called level decisions. You're comparing the level of performance from the intervention to the expected performance, the goal or aim line. Now, if you've ever monitored progress over time, you know that results tend to move up and down from time to time. This is to be expected. Looking at successive points above or below the line gives us some sense of how the intervention is working, particularly as you work through the plan implementation phase. Now, the level discussions we just discussed are important. However, if we take the level of all the data points rather than just 3, 4, or 5 consecutive data points and consider them as a whole, we have a trend of performance. Trend creates a more stable and reliable decision-making option than simply using level of performance. Trend creates a line of best fit through all the data points we've collected, and this trend allows us a direct comparison to the goal line. Now, by comparing the slope of the trend line to the goal line, you can tell if the gap is closing, in other words, that you're making progress on your goal, or if the gap is widening, in other words, you're not making progress on the goal, or if your trend is parallel to the goal line, or if the trend of performance is exactly the same as the goal. This type of trend line analysis allows for dependable decisions for instructional change, and reliable trends require approximately 12 to 14 data points. Now, there are a couple of very important things to remember when considering decision rules, and overall, remember that rules are influenced by the frequency of your progress monitoring. So always keep that in mind. And research recommends you should never use either method alone. The best thing to do is to combine trendline interpretations with visual analysis. Also, when visually analyzing data, you'll want to consider extreme values, especially those that fall at the ends of the time series. If they fall at the end of the time series, they may pull your trend line up or down. Now think about the extreme values in terms of factors that may have influenced the student on that day, and note these in the FAST system. Sometimes if there's a fluke administration that really does not fit the trend of the rest of the data, it may be best to disregard this information. Now, if we extrapolate the trend line or draw out our trend lines over time, we can estimate our progress in meeting the goal. We'll have situations where the trend shows we'll meet or exceed the goal, and we'll also have situations where the trend shows we will not meet the goal. This requires us to consider instructional change. Now, the decision-making rules we've discussed so far help us to answer the overarching formative question, is it working, and prompts us to make instructional changes throughout the process. There's also a summative component of decision-making rules when deciding if a program should be used again. Summative meaning we analyze at the end of the intervention, and this is done by looking at the mean performance of all students who received a particular intervention. So, for example, think about a group of students who all received a similar plan, such as Read Naturally. Based on the mean performance of the students and perhaps considering the range of student performance, we need to consider whether we do this again. These interventions cost time, money, and effort, so it's important to include the summative component in order to reduce the redundancy of null effects of an intervention on your student population. Understanding how to make decisions about the level and trend of performance are important processes that allow us to be instructionally responsive. Here we can establish rules or guidelines as part of the intervention plan that will essentially tell us how to respond to the data we get. Decision rules during intervention plan implementation allow for timely and defensible instructional decisions based on the data. So thanks for watching this video on decision-making rules.